now leave it to Zaskia to present our speaker today.
Thanks, Solange. There's been waiting for a long time to hear Max speak. So Max, undoubtedly very versatile and prolific writer who needs no introduction, is a Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media and Social Justice at Lakehead University, Northwest Ontario. And is also the director of ReImagining Value Action Lab, nicely acronymed as RIVO. So if I'm correct, Revenge Capitalism is Max's second book with Pluto Press. In 2018, Max's Art After Money, Money After Art was published. And in about 5 days' time, his new book, new edited collection, Vagabonds, on blending art, activism, and critical inquiry, very temptingly called The Radical Pamphlets for Fanning the Flames of Discontent, a very running theme in Revenge Capitalism as well, is going to be published. So, and Revenge Capitalism itself, a book which covers melange of themes, from finance to literature to contemporary cultural and settler colonial relationships across the world, is a tempting read. And the brilliance of the book is shouldered by the exceptional tapestry of materials and rich research that spans across disciplines. It's hard to think of another book which can discuss Shakespeare and capitalism and Kim Kardashian in the same text. So I think it's best to leave Max to do the heavy lifting and tell us about his very, very, very interesting book, and then keep us engaged. Over to you, Max.
Okay, sorry, that was muted there. Thanks so much. Thank you for organizing the seminar, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with you all. And I'm really looking forward to talking about Revenge Capitalism with you. A book that has been, I think, maybe about five or 6 years in preparation. And then it was just published in May amidst the outbreak of the pandemic. And that's made the release of the book quite unique in the sense that in some ways it's unfortunate because it's meant that we've had to forego the in-person book launches, but a very pleasant part of it, strangely, has been the opportunities that these platforms allow us to have different sorts of conversations with different audiences and different groups over the subsequent months since its release. So I'm just always so grateful to be in a space like this to discuss it with you, and that you've taken the time to read it and think about it too. I thought maybe I would begin. So I thought maybe in this sort of next 45 minutes, what I would do is I would begin by telling you a bit on a more sort of personal or biographical level about where this book came from. Then I thought I would share with you and just go over quickly the table of contents for those who haven't had a chance to read the book, just so that I can kind of show you how the argument or the arguments lay themselves out. And then I thought to go through, there's a section right at the end of the book, which is the coda to the book, where I try and summarize the key arguments of the book in 11 points. And I think that's a good place to sort of focus. So I would go over those 11 points and then maybe conclude by reflecting a little bit on the concept that I try and work towards throughout the book, which is to contrast the revenge fantasies that capitalism instills or awakens in us, and contrast them to what I term the avenging imaginary, which I'll confess at the outset is a term that I'm extremely attracted to, and yet I feel like I still didn't quite do justice to in the book. So if I have a request of you in the seminars to help me think more deeply and more thoroughly about this question of avenging imaginary, which is where I thought I would sort of conclude my remarks today. I mean, there were a number of different influences that came together in this book. One of them is that, so my entire academic career and also my career as an activist, as a social movement organizer, has been captivated by the question of the power of the imagination. And that power manifests, and I'm interested in it in two particular ways. On the one hand, I'm interested in the radical imagination, a term which I take up from writers like Robin D.G. Kelley, who has a brilliant book on the Black radical imagination, sort of details the way in which radical ideas bounce back and forth between social movements, the realm of art, the realm of literature, the realm of spirituality, and the realms of different types of protest. And also a term I take from Cornelius Castoriadis, who has a very capacious and rigorous theorization of the imagination that takes from, but also moves beyond both Marxist and Freudian approaches to that term. On the other hand, my interest in the power of the imagination has been fixated on the processes that I've and others have identified as through this term of financialization. So you may recall that during the 2007, 2008, etc. financial crisis, there was a lot of concern in the mainstream press and among academics about the rule of so-called imaginary money, the kind, as opposed to what we presume to be the real money and real economic activity of capitalism. Finance was presented at the time as the rule of a kind of dark imagination. And I, among others, sought to make the point since that time that in reality, simply using imaginary here as a kind of slur or condemnation of finance is misleading, because what under capitalism does not have its imaginative and imaginary dimension. The commodity itself runs through an imaginative and imaginary circuit. And more broadly, even beyond just the limited confines of capitalism, all societies have their imaginative and imaginary elements. And to deny that, in fact, is its own kind of fetishization, is its own kind of imaginary construct. So in that work on financialization, I wanted to ask the question, if indeed finance and this thing we call finance capital is driven by the imagination, what kind of imagination is it? What gives rise to the financial imagination? How does the imagination of the financial sector of capitalism then affect the imagination that we all have of society and of social institutions? And how in turn does financialization, as this broad global and society-wide process, to what extent is that invested in the kind of channelization, harnessing, and transformation of our imaginations on the level of everyday life and popular culture? Those two streams of thinking about the imagination led me to an interest in the dark side of the imagination, because we typically want to think about the imagination, and we're encouraged to think about the imagination in its more benevolent valences, in the sense that we celebrate it, for instance, in children, in art and culture. But of course, as any student of the history of race, racialization, and colonialism will know, the imagination has been put to the darkest uses imaginable. Race, ultimately, as this socially constructed category that emerges out of empire and colonialism, is an imaginary construct, and yet one with not only incredibly real power over people's lives, but one that's fundamentally shaped the world system that we inherit today. So thinking about the dark side of the imagination has been a kind of key question for me since the publication of my earlier books on financialization and the radical imagination in 2014. So that has been a major influence to try and go as deep and dark as I could. And that to me struck me as thinking through this question of revenge. Then, of course, secondarily, we live in a time that I characterize as one dominated by revenge politics that was sort of climaxed in the Anglo-American context by the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum, both of which have been easily and conveniently reduced to what centrist, let's use that term for a moment, centrist commentators call populism or resentment, but which I, in this book, seek to link to a broader phenomenon I'm calling revenge politics. And the argument throughout the book is that we can't understand this turn towards revenge politics without also understanding the economy that gave rise to it, which I characterize as a vengeful economy of revenge capitalism. And I'll get in a moment to a little more definition around what that means and what that looks like, and why I use that terminology. The temptation of the centrist liberal intelligentsia around the world has been to sort of bemoan the fact that seemingly out of nowhere came this scourge of vindictive, uncivil politics, and to suggest that, you know, somehow this was a pathological reaction to the march of progress as represented by the kind of neoliberal end of history. And my argument is that, in fact, that same neoliberal end of history, which was supposed to deliver us from the endless cycles of human revenge, was in fact only the continuation of a kind of revenge of the powerful by other means. And the third thing I would mention in terms of the origins of this book is simply the context in which I've been in the last three and a half years since taking up my current academic position as Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media and Social Justice at Lakehead University here in Thunder Bay. So the Canada Research Chair program, just for those outside of the Canadian context, is a sort of strange, idiosyncratically Canadian approach to trying to both emulate and distance the Canadian academic world from the American example, which is that the Canadian government about 25 years ago looked south of the border at the endowed chairs sort of system, where you'd have the so-and-so, you know, capitalist scumbag chair of whatever studies, and said, we're just going to do the same thing, except we're going to make it all sponsored by the government. So essentially it created a upper tier of research professorships. And as the beneficiary of that, I'm very thankful. But I always feel I should say, I fundamentally disagree with the program itself, because it does create a kind of tier of professors who are, compared to many of my colleagues, liberated from the toils of you know, the incredible workload that has been foisted on professors in Canada and elsewhere. And I mention this simply to say that it explains a bit about why I came to Thunder Bay, which is a very marginal, very small Canadian city of about 150,000 people. It's extremely isolated in many ways, even though it is in the middle of the country and only less than an hour's drive from the American border. The closest city to us is Minneapolis, which is 6 hours south. The closest Canadian city is Winnipeg, 8 hours to the west, and Toronto is 14 hours southeast of here. So we're very, very isolated. Thunder Bay was initially set up as the staging ground where the fur trade would emerge from into Western Canada from the Great Lakes. It's right at the edge, the western edge of the Great Lakes system, which flow into the Atlantic Ocean. And in later years, it became a major logistics hub. And since the 1960s or 70s, it has encountered the same kind of deindustrialization and shift towards an import-based services economy. It is also remarkable because whereas Indigenous people in Canada by the Canadian census, and that's a very problematic measure, represent about 4 to 5% of the Canadian population at large, and Thunder Bay, according to the same census, they represent around 15 to 17% of the population in Thunder Bay, and that estimate is likely considerably lower. It is the most, by statistical measurements, the most racist, violent city in Canada. It has the highest number of hate crimes, and Indigenous premature death in Thunder Bay is epidemic. It is has become in recent years the kind of poster image of Canada's dark underbelly. If it wishes to show to the world this kind of benevolent multicultural form of kinder, gentler capitalism, Thunder Bay belies all of its claims. And moving here as an activist and an organizer, as well as a scholar, I've become increasingly interested and curious towards how to explain the fact that a place like Thunder Bay, as a cipher in some ways for the rest of the Canadian settler colonial project, can be inherently and incessantly vengeful against Indigenous people. And indeed it is. It is horrifying. And if you want just a short snapshot of it, there's an excellent podcast produced by a local Anishinaabe journalist Ryan McMahon, titled Thunder Bay, and it gives a really vivid depiction. It won a whole variety of awards and is one of Canada's most popular podcasts. So other than simply living in a place that's so infamous, I've also been involved here in various anti-racist efforts. I am involved in an Indigenous-led feminist street patrol, which does essentially surveillance, watching the police and other authorities and trying to hold them to account, as well as trying to provide direct aid and solidarity to people who are encountering racism and privation here in the city. And that has been, and I write about it only a little bit in the book, but that has been a sort of major influence on me in the writing of this, because I've been given a sort of front row seat to, in some ways, both the depravities of what I call revenge capitalism, but also the way that those depravities are mystified. And specifically the way that a system such as the settler colonial extractive regime that is Canada's fundamental political economic bedrock is, in my terms, vengeful, acts vengefully on people, but that vengeance does not necessarily need to have any author who intends it. And in fact, even more damningly, that vengeance can occur even though every single actor who perpetuates that vengeance on an institutional level believes themselves to be benevolent and believes themselves to be generally liberal and acting in the interests of human rights. The genocidal policies continue without anyone necessarily having genocidal intent. And finally, the way that as a means to distract from the fundamental vengeful character of the system, the other of that system, the oppressed and exploited of that system, are then ascribed vengefulness as an inherent or unquenchable characteristic. So here in Thunder Bay, in the Canadian Settler Colonial Project more generally, and in the European Capitalist Colonial Project much more generally, the others of that project, the non-European subjects, are ascribed and have been ascribed for centuries the characteristic of a kind of pathological, bestial, and irresolvable vengefulness. Vengeance is then sort of displaced from the system itself and projected onto its others. And throughout the Revenge Capitalist book, I try and chart the many ways in which this displacement occurs to hide the vengeful nature of the system. It occurs, for instance, in the way that patriarchal violence, which is by far the, if we speak about actually existing revenge politics on the face of planet Earth, it's undeniable that the vast majority of revenge politics are patriarchal violence against women, trans, and non-binary people. And yet onto various patriarchal notions of femininity is projected this mythologized notion of the vengeful woman. And that takes many different cultural forms in history. Similarly, in spite of the fact that capitalism has always taken a kind of revenge on the bodies of workers, of the working class in its many different manifestations, when the working class rise up in its many manifestations, that uprising is typically and frequently labeled or categorized as pathologically vengeful, as nihilistically so, that it has no vision of a kind of future. And as I've already mentioned, we can look at many, many different anti-colonial revolts and the way in which they were framed by the powers that be as kind of this horrifying, vengeful spasm with no potential whatsoever to make a kind of transformation of thought or the world. And so these, I think, together maybe give you a sense of where this this comes from and why I found the theme of revenge to be so important. Now, I wonder if I can share a few slides if whoever's the administrator on the call can permit it, but I'll just talk them through before then. Oh, I'm a co-host now. Great. Share the screen. please bear with me 1 second here. All right. Okay. Let's see. I hope this is, it should be working. I thought maybe I would begin by just walking you through a bit about the structure of the book. The book begins with a preface, and that preface begins with a story about my father and his father. His father was a Holocaust survivor, and I use it as an opportunity to think through the way that political revenge can be stamped down in one place but emerge in a different place. And I won't go into that story now. I'd be happy to in the Q&A if it's of interest. In the introduction, I outline many of the sort of key arguments throughout the book, which I've already sort of intimated, and I'll go over in a moment. The first chapter focuses more explicitly on the present moment of revenge politics. It does so through a kind of potted biography of Stephen Bannon, who you may remember as the man who led Trump to power and now is a sort of senior dean, or maybe we should say senior grand dragon and senior Klansman of the global sort of white supremacist insurgency. Bannon was first a military officer, then he went to work in Wall Street, then he went to work in Hollywood as a financier and later as a film producer. Then he made a bunch of so-called documentary films for the far right, and then later would take on the helm of Breitbart Media before joining the Trump administration as senior advisor. And I take up in this chapter his obsession with Shakespeare's worst play, Titus Andronicus, which for those of you who've ever had the misfortune of sitting through it is basically just a long bloodbath. But the narrative of that play is about a Roman general who returns from war fighting the Goths to discover the Rome that he's been fighting for these decades is mired in corruption and racial miscegenation. And he, in spite of the fact that he has these kind of noble battlefield virtues, he's betrayed by his country and his family are slaughtered and horrible things happen to them, and then he slaughters everyone else. So this definitely agrees with Bannon's ideology of a kind of rebellion against an effete elite, neoliberal elite, with a kind of apocalyptic fury, which is supposed to end, in Bannon's view, in a kind of cleansing race war. So I use him as a way of thinking through the particular revenge politics that are arising now, but also to say that, in fact, as much as it is tempting to pathologize Trump and Bannon and their ilk, they are the natural children of a form of revenge capitalism that's been breeding and brewing for centuries. One that, as I mentioned, mystifies the inherent vindictive cruelties of capitalist and colonial accumulation by displacing that onto typically racialized, but not exclusively racialized others. In this chapter, I pick up on certain theorizations of revanchism, notably Neil Smith, the late urban geographer, colleague of David Harvey's, who talks about urban revanchism in the 1970s as a kind of white-led political movement to revenge itself on what they perceive to be the theft of their cities by racialized people and other undesirables. And this is picked up by Louis Wacquant in his reframing of the American system of mass racialized incarceration as a revanchist institutionalization, something that also Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore have noted in their abolitionist approaches to naming the prison as not a system of reform or public safety, but as one of a kind of constant and incessant racialized retribution. So this chapter, as the title implies, is one that seeks to take the idea of revenge out of the realm of emotions and affects and move it into a properly materialist frame. It does so by engaging with the few times that Marx actually writes about revenge, as well as later Marxist theorists as well. And I maybe we'll come back to this a bit later in our conversations today, but I think it's important to first disentangle revenge from notions like anger and resentment, to be able to better re-entangle them later. Because I think revenge is slightly different than those emotions or affects, and it can be used to name different things. One of the major efforts of the book is to say that it's not simply that capitalism takes revenge and is animated by revenge. It's also that capitalism shapes what we consider revenge. Revenge becomes a discursive formation that is historicized under capitalism. Revenge in different civilizations has different names, takes different forms, and has different borders around its concept. Within the kind of capitalist colonial world system that we inherit and are in the process of perpetuating, unfortunately, these days, there is a way that our understanding of what revenge is has been fundamentally shaped by that system. And so part of the effort of the book is to suggest that we can reclaim the language and the analytic frame of revenge as a methodology for naming certain, what might have at first appear as inexplicable pathologies of the capitalist system. And those pathologies, I focus on three throughout the book. One is what I pick up on as surplus populations, which is to say those populations which now perhaps include the majority of people on the planet who have been made dependent on the circuits of capital, which is to say wages. They no longer have the means of agricultural or other forms of self-sufficiency, thanks to the kind of constant accumulation by dispossession and enclosure of life that has marked capitalism's global spread. So they are dependent on capitalism, and they are dependent on their participation in capitalism, as indeed we all are. And yet, for this surplus population, capitalism is not dependent on them. There are enough laboring bodies around the world to produce and reproduce capitalism. And so you have the growth of large populations who are essentially, at least in the eyes of the economic system and its sort of inherent logics, left to die. They may survive through their solidarity, through the actions of nation states, which provide various forms of security, through charity, but ultimately in the eyes of capitalism itself, these surplus populations are disposable or sacrificial, if you want a slightly different language. The second sort of pathology of revenge capitalism that I focus on, that I think revenge helps us explain, is what I call hyper-enclosure. So this includes the ways that, especially through new digital technologies, capitalism has been able to expand its fundamental processes of accumulation by dispossession, or what I think sometimes goes under the terminology of primitive accumulation, into areas and spheres of life where it hitherto had not been able to access. So this might include for instance, the incredibly challenging and frankly terrifying ways that that a new sort of digitized and financialized capitalism is reaching into the fabric of everyday life. We've seen in past decades the way that everything from education to housing, even to personal relationships, has been financialized. But now we're also seeing the expansion of capitalist accumulation and logics of speculative accumulation into the realm of the digital, the monetization of data, the monetization and capture of attention, and the kind of granular affective and sensory life of the human animal in a moment where we're all constantly plugged into digital technology. So I name this sort of broad spectrum of ways in which capitalism is reaching into ever more spheres of life and is no longer simply content to harness physically embodied or even emotionally embodied labor power, but is in fact sort of seeking to mine the most minute horizon of the human subject as hyper-enclosure. And then third and finally, the kind of otherwise inexplicable or difficult to explain feature of revenge capitalism that I focus on throughout the book is the proliferation of unpayable debts. And this maybe brings us to the second chapter, which is the work of art, or the work of art in an age of unpayable debts, social reproduction, geopolitics, and settler colonialism. And here I focus on the work of three different artists who in some way, shape, or form are trying to contend with, in the present moment, the problem of unpayable debts in a global world. Now, these are debts, I argue, that everyone understands are not going to be repaid, and yet they remain enforced. So one of these that I look at is the debt of Greece, for instance, which, you know, the IMF and the Troika, the European Central Bank and European Commission, they all admit quite freely that Greece will never be able to repay its debt, and yet that debt continues to be enforced. On the flip side, though, we also have the completely unpayable debt of the United States of America, which also is unpayable. It's far too massive, and yet the forms of enforcement that are applied there are, of course, far more gentle and less consequential in many ways. But we also have the unpayable debts on the level of everyday life as well. For instance, there's estimates now that in the United Kingdom, somewhere between a quarter and a third of people who are retiring now or will retire in the next 5 to 10 years will never be able to pay back the debts that they owe before they die. And what does it mean to live in a world that is characterized by the imposition of these unpayable debts? I recently learned, in fact, that the great theorist Denise Ferreira da Silva has a new book coming out next year, I think, called Unpayable Debt. So I refer you to that, which will, I'm sure, make those arguments in a much more sophisticated and complex and nuanced way than I possibly could. The one thing that I try and bring up in this chapter is to say that there's also the unpayable debts from below, as I put it, as in contrast to the kind of methodology of power that imposes unpayable debts from above. There are the unpayable debts from below that are sometimes demanded or sometimes simply are in the subtext of the global field. And these include, for instance, reparations for slavery and colonialism. They're the debts that are owed to the working classes for the exploitation of their labor. And these debts, as Walter Benjamin pointed out almost 100 years ago now, I guess 80 years or so, these debts are not settled cheaply. These are the debts that have a kind of prophetic or apocalyptic characteristic to them that have the potential to create a rupture within what can appear to be the overarching and sutured field of capitalist production. From debt, I continue to think through money. And as you'll see in this slide that I'm showing here, there are interludes that intersperse these. So the way that we move from the structures of racial capitalism as revenge to debt is through a reading of Merchant of Venice and a rereading of Shylock as a kind of revolutionary anti-colonial figure. The transition from thinking about debt to thinking about money comes in Moby Dick, where, if those of you who've read the book might remember the scene where the Ahab, the captain who has sworn his vengeance against Moby Dick, the whale, nails an Ecuadorian coin to the mast of the ship and says, whoever spots Moby Dick first and shouts out that we can hunt him will get this coin. And throughout the rest of the novel, the coin plays a very interesting role as a form of both mediation, but also the kind of lure of revenge, and the way in which the revenge of the captain of the sort of ruling class, as C.L.R. James frames it in his very interesting reading of Moby Dick, how that fetish object becomes a means by which the entire crew, which James frames as the proletariat, become fixated on the revenge that is narrated or given by Ahab and the ruling class. In the third chapter, Money as a Medium of Vengeance, Colonial Accumulation, and Proletarian Practices, I try and tell a number of uncommon stories about money, and I take as my target here the way in which neoliberal philosophers, notably Niall Ferguson, but also others, to a certain extent Steven Pinker, suggest that the rise of money into its modern form has been the progression of peace, and in some ways the quenching or overcoming of revenge, something that I think they mistakenly take from the work of Adam Smith, but I actually think Smith's view is much more interesting and complex. Against that, I suggest, what if we look at money not from the perspective of, to put it clearly, the ruling class, but instead take a look at money from the perspective of those against whom money has always been weaponized, which is to say, the working classes and colonized people. And I tell the story of the way in which wampum was weaponized in the contact zone or the contact economy, what Kesu Park calls the contact economy of what get called the northeastern woodlands of Turtle Island or North America. This happened with Dutch and English traders in the area now known as Connecticut and New York, where these traders essentially discovered that indigenous people highly valued purple and white beads made from whelk and quahog shells that were harvested along the beaches in Connecticut and Long Island. And based on a series of acts of initial primitive accumulation, the European traders managed to get a kind of a hoard of this shell commodity, which was used by indigenous groups for all sorts of reasons, including placating and calming the spirits of revenge within indigenous communities and between indigenous nations. And they weaponized it by making it essentially legal tender that they then forced the indigenous people whom they were trading with to use in exchange for furs. And so in a weird way, this very poetic and useful semi-spiritual commodity that indigenous people had been using for centuries became weaponized as a means by which capitalism, or sort of a proto-capitalist form, was imposed upon that region of the world as a methodology of dispossession and the elimination of indigenous presence on those lands. I also tell the story in this chapter of how working class people within Europe and the United States developed repertoires that today are almost lost to history of effacing and scraping the symbolism off of coins and using them as a canvas for their own kinds of communication and communion, their own kinds of non-monetary or non-calculative economies, as a form of revenge against the sort of wages of capitalist vengeance. We transition then through this reading of the popular reality television show Khloe Kardashian's Revenge Body, which is a horrifying sort of fat-phobic and I would say misogynistic show, which features usually, but not exclusively, a woman seeking, it's a reality TV show, seeking to lose weight in order to take revenge on somebody who once did them wrong. So this is archetypically an ex-boyfriend who dumps them because of their weight or body type. And then the show follows this character as they try and lose weight, as to take a kind of form of revenge. And while it's cloaked in a discourse of we're all cheering on the Avenger to hope that she, in the proverbial case, is able to succeed and rise above her challenges, in fact, underneath it, there's a kind of vindictiveness that the audience is hailed into or encouraged to adopt by the very structures and forms of the show that are, again, deeply saturated with both fat-phobic and misogynistic ideas and ideals. And I contrast this to a very interesting set of statements from Zapatista women, where they talk about the need to overcome the fixation on the individual body, written as a response to the way in which many of their would-be allies who came to a women's gathering in Chiapas, Mexico several years ago, seem to be increasingly fixated on challenging capitalism, colonialism through the actions of the individuated body, mindfulness practices, certain sort of isolating healing practices, yoga, these sorts of things that we recognize as kind of pathologies of a kind of romantic anti-capitalism within capitalist societies. This turn to the body allows me then in the 4th chapter to think about the US opioid epidemic. And for those of you outside of the United States or who haven't heard much about it, to summarize very briefly, this epidemic, which began in the late 90s and reached its peak only a few years ago, has claimed the lives of at least 500,000 people, according to the Centers for Disease Control, which is a very conservative estimate, and ruined the life of many, many more. It was caused when particularly one corporation called Purdue Pharma, but they, along with a bunch of other pharmaceutical corporations, basically managed to game the Food and Drug Administration of the United States and other regulatory bodies to be able to suggest that a prescription opioid somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 times more powerful than opium itself was safe to be prescribed by doctors for non-palliative pain. So morphine has long been used and other opioids for patients who are dying. But the drug companies in this case were able to market a drug that was highly, highly addictive for things like recovery from surgery, for instance, or chronic pain from a workplace injury. What happened because of this is a massive spike in prescription opioid use and misuse and prescriptions across the United States, accelerated by the incredibly heavy-handed marketing tactics of Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical corporations, that then left millions of people addicted to something on par with, if not more powerful than street heroin. This was especially the case in certain jurisdictions, and this leads us to a way into talking about the complexities of racial capitalism in our moment. The drug companies specifically targeted doctors for advertisements in areas that were largely white and where many of the residents were on long-term disability or had healthcare and pharmacare plans through their employers or farmer employers. So this included the Rust Belt of the United States. It included sort of Appalachia. It included the exurbs around major cities in the United States. And what this led to is a commentary from both mainstream journalists as well as white supremacists that this opioid epidemic was the scourge exclusively or predominantly of white people in the United States, and that it revealed that all of the focus around Black and racialized disenfranchisement and oppression in the United States was overblown, and that we should in fact be focusing more on the plight of white people. I argue in this chapter that in fact that is not actually the case, that this epidemic affected many, many different parts of the American population. However, it does impel us to think through a little more closely what whiteness is. And I make an argument, which I don't have so much time to get into right now, that in fact we can understand whiteness as, of course, as a social construction, but as a social construction that operates in a way that we might well understand as an addiction and as an opiate. An opiate in the sense that fundamentally whiteness is about the dulling of the aestheses, of the senses, of sympathies, of empathy. It is a way in which certain subjects who are afforded afforded belonging within whiteness then dull their sympathies and their solidarities with others to the extent that they buy into the mythscape of whiteness. It is also an addiction in a sense that, especially in a moment where there is changing global circumstances that no longer allow for the kind of white supremacist contract that animated American capitalism historically since its foundations and through the Keynesian post-war period, a situation in which many, many white people are materially, but also symbolically and spiritually becoming poorer and poorer and more precarious. The drug, the narcotic effect, the addictive effect of whiteness becomes less and less and less effective, leading to the kinds of vengeful affects and structures that I'm seeking to identify throughout the book. through a reading of V for Vendetta and Joker, I move then to the final chapter, which is on dead zones, subtitled Financialized Nihilism, Toxic Wealth, and Vindictive Technologies. And here I take up a metaphor that has been worked before me by David Graeber and Henry Giroux about the dead zone as a way of explaining some facet or element of the moment of capitalism that we find ourselves in right now. Dead zones, just to review, in the natural world, are the results of a process known as eutrophication, which means from the Latin, too much good feeding. It refers to a problem in that typically is marked by industrialized agriculture, where fertilizers and animal waste wash into aquasystems and then accumulate at the mouths of rivers, famously at the mouth of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico near New Orleans, where it leads to a bloom of toxic algae. The algae then blot out the light because they live on the surface of the water. The flora and fauna underneath are starved of light and die. And the bacteria that eats the now dying flora and fauna consumes the oxygen in the water. And it's through this consumption of the oxygen, which leaves the water essentially incapable of hosting new life, even after the old life has died out. So I draw on this metaphor of the dead zone to talk about a number of different examples. One, for instance, and these examples have in common the way that financialized capitalist wealth, now accelerated by digital technology, floods into areas, and the flood of this kind of toxic nutrition leads to a kind of dead zone. So one example is gentrification, where a flood of outside investment creates a situation that blights the life that already existed there, that in fact attracted the outside investment in the first place, and leaves behind a dead zone. We can also look at the way that indigenous and peasant communities around the world are threatened by the influx of wealth from, for instance, new extractive and mining efforts, that then, when they leave, or even while they're still in situ, drain the area of life and vitality and lead to a dead zone. But I also, in this chapter, am trying to think through the particular dead zones that form within each of us through our use of the particular corporate manifestations of digital technology that have become so quotidian in the last decades. The kind of dead zone that forms within us through the infinite scroll as we make our way through our news feeds, or the particular sense of overstimulated nihilism that we get from a life of endless Zoom meetings, as we've come to understand all too well. And I link this finally to the kind of inherent dead zone at the core of all systems of power, which I take from Fanon's radical rereading of Hegel, the notion that the powerful, the master, so to speak, is always dependent on those whom they oppress, the so-called slave, for a strange kind of bottom-up recognition. And this means that at the heart of power, there is always a kind of dead zone of dependency that leads to revenge politics. There's something about the hollowness at the core of the powerful that leads to the kind of phobic, violent reaction that characterizes what animates the affects of revenge that take their systemic form, or that are expressions of the systemic form as well. Now, to turn very briefly to the conclusion, revenge fantasy or avenging imaginary. Here I seek to suggest a number of different things. The first is that capitalism is not just a revenge system, it's also a system that gives birth to revenge fantasies. And I want to draw our attention to a very interesting passage there, where I quote from the German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch from his Principles of Hope, where he speaks about the revenge that the Nazis preyed upon, the sentiments of revenge in Germany in the 1920s and 30s that the Nazis preyed upon. And it's tempting to imagine that this revenge came from the disenfranchised, hungry, and belittled working class. But Bloch is very careful to say, no, the core of the Nazi ideology was an appeal to the petty bourgeoisie, which is to say those members of the capitalist class who are not really have no control over capitalism in any meaningful sense, as the higher bourgeoisie may in fact do, the owners of factories, the means of production, and yet are imagine themselves and identify with the bourgeoisie. So they are privileged within capitalism, but powerless within it. These include small business people, certain caste of professionals, entrepreneurs, others. And he suggests that it's from this moment of privilege but powerlessness that the revenge, the sentiment of revenge arises within capitalism. And I try and carry this forward into our own moment and unpack it a little bit through some references to popular culture. As well as link it then to the kind of revenge politics that are of concern to all of us in terms of the rise of the far right in our day and age. And then at the final part of the chapter, I try and turn away from this, the way in which capitalism instills and awakens revenge fantasies in us towards what I call the avenging imaginary. The avenging imaginary for me is still, in some senses, I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, a bit of a placeholder of a term. I'm still trying to parse out or think through exactly what I mean by it, though I do want to hold fast to it in some profound way. For me, the avenging imaginary is one that fundamentally seeks to go beyond the idea of getting back at someone or something to repay the crime that was done to you in the same coin in which it was dealt. Rather, the avenging imaginary has an abolitionist flavor to it, which is to say that the abolitionist imaginary, and here I take a lot of inspiration from the Black feminist tradition in the United States, as well as broader feminist traditions as well. The avenging imaginary is one that seeks to abolish the system that allowed the harm to be created in the first place, rather than simply to cause a reciprocal or equivalent or even a poetic harm. And for me, the appeal of the avenging imaginary is that it does not simply move us into a space of what I call reconciliophilia, which is this kind of liberal obsession with reconciliation, forgiveness, and nonviolence. I want to reject that completely in many ways, but rather to say, how can we stay with revenge and use revenge as a methodology for understanding and framing our struggles today against and beyond capitalism, while moving it outside of the ways in which we are conventionally thinking about revenge as this kind of strange balancing of the scales or this strange kind of nihilistic equivalency. Rather, I think the avenging imaginary, which, as I say in the book, is the reckless conviction that what you love in this world has value in a world in which it is rendered worthless. I suppose I want to start from that position to then build a notion of the avenging imaginary, capacious enough, but also generative and exciting enough that it could be a concept that is useful in the struggles to come. And I suppose with that, I'll bring these comments to a close and really look forward to the conversation. I'll just see if I can actually turn off this slide sharing.
We'll be happy to take up questions at this moment. If someone is still contemplating, I think I have one for you, Max.
And I'm listening. I'm just trying to figure out actually how to turn off this screen sharing. I closed a window and yeah. Oh dear. Here we go. Okay. Apologies.
Yes. Full disclosure, I am a lawyer, so I kept looking for traces of law in the text because, well, there is law everywhere in the material that you have drawn together as a spectral presence, but not as something that's tangible, because law has its own conception of revenge, vengeance, retribution, and at least when you type in revenge and law in any of the searches, the first thing that comes up is revenge porn, which we have dealt with, the scripted body and something to be avenged. But in terms of punishment and ordering someone's violence, ensuring that the capitalist machinery works smoothly in regulation in various forms. Law has its own conceptions of revenge and vengeance. If you look at the literature of criminologists in mid-1990s, for them, revenge has always been about passion, and retribution that's channeled through courtrooms is something about reason, something that's predictable and then consistent. So why is the space of court where you order and designate revenge and retribution into certain categories, and one is validated, the other one negated? Why has it been left out of revenge capitalism? Because you look at carceral institutions, which is very important and it does touch upon, it's not completely not there, but yeah, your take on this.
Yeah, thank you. It's left out of revenge capitalism because I really know very little about it. I think there's a couple of places where it maybe does appear, and it appears when I'm trying to identify the law itself as vengeful, but self-mystifying in its vengefulness. So you have, for instance, the case of, I speak in the book in the chapter on money about the strange case of convict love tokens. So in the late 18th and early 19th century, working class Londoners, who, as always bears repeating, were a very multi-ethnic and multicultural mix, were arrested and put in prison, specifically Newgate, but other prisons as well in London, for a whole variety of crimes that had to do with misusing money. So this might include counterfeiting, or handling counterfeit money, or signing bad notes, or effacing, like coin clipping, like clipping the edge off a coin to take the precious metals. And through a series of laws that were originally pioneered in sort of the days of war between the UK, between sort of England, or Britain, and the British Empire, and the French, and then the Americans, the British Empire became increasingly paranoid about the quality of money, and so passed basically a bevy of laws that made any infraction against money punishable by death. And of course, as you might imagine, poor working class people in London didn't have the means to hire lawyers. So essentially the law was entirely punitive. They would never really be able to argue their case. And so you had a situation where for these really quite petty crimes, often which were crimes of desperation or poverty, you had the law acting vengefully, and this population became a group that was then sent overseas. The capital punishment of death was often commuted to transportation for a period of 7 years or for life, and these became kind of the cannon fodder of settler colonial populations in places like Australia or Canada or United States or elsewhere. So in this example, I want to take up the way in which the law, though it claims to be enforcing the rule of law and defending society from these endless cycles of revenge, is in fact itself vengeful and part of a system that is taking a kind of revenge on working class people. And I think that's my point, I guess, about the law, and I admit I don't make it particularly well or comprehensively, is simply that there's been a tendency in the kind of development of kind of capitalist and colonial thought to presume that the purpose of the law is to save society from endless cycles of revenge, that what existed before the law was a kind of state of nature which was dominated by revenge. And this takes many different forms. I mean, it's literally there in the work of someone like Locke, who really frames it that way. It is even there in the work of Hannah Arendt, who basically says that only at the moment when you have forgiveness, the possibility of forgiveness, that happens through institutions like the law, is it possible for sort of history to even begin? Because then we escape these cycles of needless vengeance, which she and Locke project back onto a prehistory of the pre-law moment. And as many people have noted, most recently I've been reading the work of Denise Ferreira da Silva, these prehistories are not only historiographic, they're also geographic. So the prehistory gets projected onto the others of Europe who are said to be lawless. You know, and in the case of the chapter on money, the lawlessness is projected onto indigenous people as a means to suggest that they have no legitimate laws themselves, therefore their land can be seized, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess what I'm interested in the question of law is sort of two things. One of them is how like sort of hegemonic notions of law are predicated upon this belief in a fundamentally vengeful human spirit, which gets tamed by sovereignty and its laws, but also secondarily how the kind of notion of the rule of law gets used as legitimating itself as a means to prevent that primordial revenge from consuming society. The law then gets used as a methodology for perpetuating forms of systemic revenge that can't speak their name. And certainly, I mean, just maybe to bring it back to what I began with in our discussion today, we see this all the time here in Thunder Bay, for instance. You know, like the rate of incarceration for Indigenous people in Thunder Bay is around 75 to 80% of the people in the city's jails, while Indigenous people represent 15 to 20% of the population here. So there is a way in which the law is working vindictively in this space. And yet at the same time, I don't want to bracket out completely the possibilities of legal activism in various ways, but I want to think carefully about what those would look like.
Sure. Thanks very much. I think we have next question.
Yes, may I? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for, well, absolutely brilliant. I'm a professor here in Brazil at the University of São Paulo. And, well, I really loved your approach. Very, very interesting. I want to put forward one question, but with lots of implications. I understand and I appreciate the way you turn the idealist perspective upside down, which is like going back to the master and slave dialectics and concentrating on how this conflict really leads the way. And in a sense, capitalism, the whole history of capitalism becomes a successive cycles of primitive accumulation. On the other hand, I think that one of the key aspects of Marx has been exactly to, in a sense, prove, to demonstrate, or to take us into this more abstract sphere where primitive capitalism is also an original. It has a kind of temporality of it in itself, so that it's really superseded, overcome by a logic, by the logic of capital, and of course the master-slave relationship, the master-slave dialectic, is in a way expressed in the capital-labor relation, but the capital-labor relation is really something that goes beyond the violence, the explicit violence of a pre-capitalist model into an idealistic sphere. It's really a logic of capital accumulation. And especially here in Brazil and Latin America, we are well aware of the difficulties, the challenging that's implicit in going beyond pure and open violence, because we've been through this over and over. But we understand that there is this sphere that goes beyond violence and constitutes itself as law, logic, models, policies, civil society, and all that. So the question in short is, are we necessarily going back to a illogical or, in a sense, strictly materialistic approach to these conflicts, and then just discard the very important idea and really strong idea that capitalism has a logic in itself, and it goes beyond? Because even in Hegel, I mean, the master-slave moment is a moment in the history of the idea, or in the phenomenology of the absolute. So in a sense, aren't we, by going back to the master-slave relationship and categorizing everything as pure and materialistic revenge and violence? Are we giving up the idea that there is a logic to the system and that overcoming the system means actually designing a new logic? That's the main question. And specifically with respect to money and technology, I would like to really tease you with this idea that maybe, as the same with the logic goes with the technology, maybe new currencies or new forms of digital organization like social currencies, so-called complementary currencies, or systems that in a way may empower decentralized communities to organize themselves and elaborate subjective modes of regulation might be a way out towards a new logic rather than, going back to the subjective revenge, which would be, we've seen over history, like Marxists and communists, they have seized power and then they don't do the same thing, but in a sense, they reproduce the master-slave relation of some sort of oppression. So what is a way out of this logic into a logic of freedom rather than a materialistic revenge that puts us out of, in a sense, idealistic progress through history?
That's a great question to which I wish I had an answer. I feel like the book is in some ways just an attempt to clear a little more ground to help us come to a place where we can better ask precisely that question of how do we hold fast to the idea that we deserve a different world without simply allowing that to descend into a kind of vengeance. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I think I agree with you that I think I'm not trying to argue in this book that I'm not sort of trying to insist that the primary or most important feature of capitalism is its explicit moment of violent vengeance. I think I'm trying to say that there is always that moment, and that if you peel back the skin, so to speak, if you peel back the surface, you will find those moments of violent revenge. But actually what I'm more interested in throughout the book are those moments when revenge, as I mentioned at the beginning, is authorless and not intended, when it just takes the form of the logic of institutions which often don't even see themselves as connected to capitalism. And I think law is one example of that, where, the vast majority of lawyers would not even see what they do, or judges, as having anything to do with the economic system of which they're a part. But also in terms of the perpetuation of systemic, structural, and institutionalized forms of racism, the ways in which poverty is perpetuated through systems and cycles of sort of sabotage of the poor and the working class. So I'm very interested throughout the book in marking the ways in which revenge is expressed at those so-called higher or more, let's say, more abstracted levels of capitalist accumulation. And it's what we use to maybe call like this model, but all those aspects which don't seem at first glance to be directly connected to the processes of capitalist accumulation. In terms of currencies, I mean, I do make the argument in that chapter on the book of the book on money that in some ways money, though it is presented to us as this technology of peace and disinterested commerce, is a form of revenge that capitalism operationalizes. I think that argument is in many ways intended and comes out of my engagement with a series of very interesting conversations hosted by the Institute for Network Cultures at the Hogeschool in Amsterdam through under the banner of Money Lab. So now the 8th conference of Money Lab just concluded, and it's a venue where activists and scholars and technologists and weirdos get together and talk about the future of money. And one of the things I began to notice in those conversations is that there is this enthusiasm to imagine that monetary innovation, like the development of new currencies, will in and of themselves create the conditions to transcend capitalism, or at least the vengeful aspects of capitalism. And my sort of rebuttal in that, which takes its form in this book in that chapter, is to say, I think there is a huge amount of potential for these new technologies to be used, but I think that potential rests not in their inherent technological or design features, which is the fetish that most people want. You know, they're like, oh, how can we design a new currency that's going to be completely decentralized and totally autonomous? Rather, I think that the biggest question is, how do such currencies or technologies allow us to organize human cooperation differently? Because fundamentally, I join a sort of a group of autonomous Marxist theorists who frame capitalism as a methodology by which human cooperation is organized against itself, essentially, in the interests of the endless accumulation of an abstract, which is to say capital. And if we take that as the main problem, then what we need is not so much better systems and schemes and technologies. What we need is to cooperate in different ways. And that can take place on a micro level, in the sense of people in their own lives cooperating to provide themselves with resources, with the things they need, with care, with solidarity in different ways. But I think it also then has to take place on the level of society and global society more generally. In the sense of, how are we going to coordinate? We have the capitalist system today coordinates the cooperative energies of 4 to 6 billion people. What else will coordinate those energies? If we want to maintain an economy that's going to have the capacity to produce highly complex commodities that require thousands of hands, you know, like all of the machines that we're using right now to communicate. We want to have a society that's that interdependent. What other frameworks and methodologies of social cooperation will we need to invent in order to sustain that, or to transform it radically? And I think that's the much more interesting question for me around currencies and the possibilities of them. But it's just such a huge question.
Yes, I actually had 2 questions, Max. First of all, yeah, thank you so much to have walked us through your book so meticulously. And I have to admit that I've already seen a presentation of yours at Historical Materialism, and back then I did not fully understand. I was a bit perplexed sitting there. What is this about, right? So I think that it's a 15, the format is really absurd. This 15-minute paper, I think they're down at. So I think it really needed those 45 minutes, or at least more time to sort of elaborate on the points that you make in your book. And I thought so I thought it was really interesting how you reread or are reading capitalism through these mechanisms of revenge strategies. And I was wondering, so the first question is in finance, and the second question is on the question of nonviolence that I found very interesting as well. So you started off by saying that financialization brings about this whole new kind of imaginary of money, and this kind of this dark imagination whereby, you know, there's often talk about this kind of fictitious capital, and it's all this kind of abstract thing that we don't really understand. So I kind of got that from it. But how and how it changes our daily lives, our imaginaries about money in our daily lives. So I found it's very interesting. But how do you? So I was just wondering how you tie that back to then these notions of revenge. And then about you rejecting nonviolence, I think I absolutely agree with that. And I always felt that it was this kind of, maybe also for our generation, a bit difficult to understand, a position that has become very difficult to understand, because we're all sort of feeling now the violence of kind of austerity politics and all that. So it always seemed to me to be this very privileged position to be taken. And I really liked the blog you mentioned, and whereby you said, so I felt, oh, maybe it's really about this kind of position, about a privilege, but then but not having the power in the same sense, maybe that is, or advocating for non-violence is that you're not experiencing violence yourself, and you are not the author or the doer of the violence in that dynamics. So I was wondering if you could expand a bit, perhaps, because you mentioned Hannah Arendt as well, on the political significance of non-violence. Like, what is the politics of non-violence according to you?
All right, those are both such great questions. Thank you. The link between finance and revenge. I'll give you a couple of examples from the book, but I want to signal that it is a bit of a tense gap in the book, and it's a tense gap for me because as I mentioned at the beginning, I approached the question of revenge convinced that it had something to do with finance, and I think I mapped a number of those ways, but I don't think I've yet quite found a way to link them exactly. So what I will say is, I think I see finance and finance capitalism as exemplary, both exemplary of and a coordination of the many anonymous and unintended violences of capitalism. If you consider the way that financial speculation plays havoc with agricultural commodity prices and destroys the lives of people around the world, if you consider the way that finance accelerates gentrification and the sort of social and often ethnic cleansing of cities, or the way in which finance has aided and abetted the last 40 years of neoliberal globalization, which has decimated workers' rights and environmental protections by allowing capital to play different jurisdictions off against each other in a kind of race to the bottom. All of these, to me, like if you to zoom out into the orbit of Earth and squint your eyes, that looks like revenge. It looks like the capitalist system as a whole is taking a needless, warrantless revenge on humanity for no readily apparent reason. And that's the kind of beginning of the book in some way. And a revenge that no one necessarily intends. Like even the most villainous, cackling person at Goldman Sachs is not sitting there being like, and we're going to destroy the earth with climate change. I mean, would that it were so simple. So I'm trying to understand throughout the book the way that capitalism can take revenge, even though we can't ascribe human motivations to a system, especially not to capitalism. And to play with this idea that somehow if we hold fast to the idea that capitalism is vengeful and that vengefulness in some way passes through a phase of finance and financialization, we'll come to an understanding, or at least at very least a useful metaphor for what capitalism is doing now. That said, I think there are certain ways in which certain operations of capitalism and finance can be seen as, in a weird way, directly vengeful. So, I would not be the first to argue that financialization, as it transpires from the 1970s onwards, and especially through the 80s and 90s, must be seen in a way as capitalism's response to the power of social movements in the 1960s. My former supervisor, the late Randy Martin at NYU, theorized financialization as capitalism's response, and I would say revenge for what he calls decolonization on two levels. On the one hand, the formal decolonization of the colonized world, and on a more metaphoric basis, the sort of decolonization of everyday life that was the mainstay of social movements, especially in the global north in the 1960s and 70s, feminist movements, queer movements, student movements, etc. In the first case, that decolonization, the revenge against decolonization in the global south of formerly colonized nation states, is that within a decade, many of them become neo-colonized, to use that sort of older language, by finance capital. You essentially have nation states heavily encumbered by debts, mostly debts owed to the former colonial powers or their banking institutions, which perpetuate the system as such. And on the level of metaphoric decolonization in sort of urban global northern spaces, let's say, financialization is part and parcel of this kind of commodification of social difference that takes place in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, where in a way you begin to see a capitalism that is willing to extend credit metaphorically and literally to all sorts of different populations who are formerly discredited, literally and metaphorically, and not allowed into the kind of post-war compromise. And so financialization becomes a means to co-opt and contain and channelize these movements as, again, a kind of revenge against the way that these movements were uprisings against the post-war capitalist compromise. And perhaps indeed as a kind of revenge for the post-war compromise itself, which was always an inhibition on the kind of laissez-faire, reckless capitalism that came before. So I suppose the manifestation of that I take up in the book most is debt and unpayable debt. And I think if we look at the way that unpayable debts work upon our lives in terms of student loans, student debts, or the other forms of debts that are imposed on whole countries, like say Greece or the nation of Puerto Rico, or many, many nations in the global south, quintessentially Haiti, and the way that since their uprising of the enslaved and the formation of the Haitian Republic, that country has been the target of financialized debt, encumbrance, and revenge. Financialization, through its mechanisms of debt, operates in a kind of vengeful fashion. But I don't think that those explanations that I've just offered exhaust the possibilities of thinking through financialization as revenge. In terms of nonviolence, yeah, I mean, I agree. And we're seeing it again. It's so predictable and awful that even in this moment of incredible uprisings led mostly by young people and racialized young people in this next wave that emerged out of the murder, the sort of vindictive murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, that we once again see mainstream commentators making these strange calls for nonviolence, which don't, I think, make any sense. They don't make any sense in terms of the strategy they present, because first of all, these demonstrations have largely been nonviolent. There might have been property destruction, but you know, these demonstrations are not targeting living individuals. So why they would be presented as violent and why then there would be a call for nonviolence befuddles me completely. It doesn't actually, but I think I understand why they make those calls, but they don't make sense on the face of it. But then I think they don't make sense strategically as well, because as when you have a kind of let's say, without being ageist, a graying tendency within certain liberal quarters, and by gray I think I here don't just mean the color of people's hair, but also the kind of vagueness of its ambitions and scope. When you have a kind of graying tendency that demands, that sort of warns about cancel culture or warns about the rise of violence, it's a very particular strategy, because to whom does it call? What is the best case scenario here? That all those people who are allegedly being violent or canceling people are going to say like, oh, a letter in Harper's Magazine, I better think again about what I've been doing this whole time. Or, you know, like there's a strange way that it makes a claim to be speaking to a certain audience and making a certain warning, but it's actually speaking to a completely different audience. And I think it speaks exactly to what you're mentioning. The audience that it's speaking to are people who have a great deal of what gets called like privilege within the system. But I think you're right. I haven't thought about it this way before, that it's a privilege that is also ultimately powerless. It's, you know, like Benjamin's Angel of History, watching wreckage unfold behind it as it's blown by forces beyond its control. And I think that helps us maybe understand why nonviolence has been so fetishized. Because in some ways it's like, it's in the vein of what I've termed reconcilophilia in the book, it's a way in which people can feel they have a sense of power over history. They have a sense of moral superiority over those who are ascribed violent motivations or intentions or actions. But I think ultimately I mean, fundamentally, and Angela Davis pointed this out in that famous video clip that's on the Black Power mixtape, which many of us have seen, where she, when posed with the question of violence and nonviolence, she's just like, how can you even talk to me about violence in a situation where systemic and structural and institutional violence, as well as explicit racist violence, is constant and unceasing. It's not the question we should be asking. But then my question is always, well, I mean, whose interests does it serve for us to keep asking the question? Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. Yes. That question about what it is revenge for, I think is complex because, again, I'm playing with this metaphor from a number of different angles, and they get tangled up for me. I think on the one level, yes, what you mentioned, I think I agree with, which is that I understand capitalism to be animated by a horrific nihilistic lack at its core, as all systems of power, I think, are on some level. Capitalism, as Marx, of course, pointed out, is this vampire that needs to suck on the blood, on the living labor of workers, and lives this kind of vengeful half-life or undead existence. And in the chapter on dead zones, I try and link this to the way in which other powerful groups, other groups that are empowered by systems, also have this kind of constant vengefulness towards those whom they oppress that doesn't actually seem to make a lot of sense. So, you know, a quintessential and excellent example is, again, to go back to the epidemic of femicide and murderous violence against trans and non-binary people. There's something at the core of patriarchy which is organized around this socially constructed notion of masculinity that both privileges and empowers those who bear masculinity and who are permitted to bear masculinity, and also organizes itself around a constant revenge against its others, for its very own social constructedness and its own hollowness at its core. But of course, the problem is that, like, that is a useful explanation for human behavior. It's not necessarily a useful explanation for a system, because a system isn't a human. It doesn't have the same motivations. And so then I go to try and understand what is the revenge for, to another kind of history, which is in the colony, the way in which colonists and enslavers constantly take this kind of excessive, needless revenge against those whom they oppress and enslave. And it's justified because there is a fear of the revenge of those whom they oppress and enslave. So if it's like, if we don't take this preemptive, preventive revenge on these people, they're going to rise up and cut our heads off. Putting aside the fact that these people deserve to have their heads cut off, that fear then licenses a kind of revenge which names itself as law and order, or names itself as justified and legitimate. Even though I think ultimately, even if you sat down with the people who were the authors of that violence, they would say, actually, it's probably excessive, but we do it anyway. So I go there, but again, this doesn't necessarily explain the vengeance of a system. It explains the vengeance of operatives and beneficiaries of the system, but it doesn't necessarily explain what is the system taking revenge for. And so ultimately where I come to is that it takes revenge for no reason. And my answer is, we need to, again, reclaim the discursive ground around this notion of revenge in order to craft a term that allows us to name the irrational and ultimately, in some ways, self-defeating elements of capitalism. And those irrational, self-defeating moments of capitalism emerge, as Marx taught us so long ago, from internal contradictions. So why, for instance, is capitalism right now creating a system of climate change which is going to dispossess billions of people in the next 50 years? It doesn't seem to make any sense. It emerges out of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, that the capitalist class is not unified, that there are rivalries in many, many different ways between different groups, and that's just the way things play out. And that's and so the notion of revenge tries to draw us back to that structural and systemic understanding of capitalism's motivations as emerging from contradiction rather than emerging from intention. In terms of temporality, it's another great question. I think you're absolutely right, and the book in some ways has always been inspired and haunted by precisely that line from Benjamin, that what the Social Democrats in Germany gave up and how they set the stage for the Nazis was by imagining that the debt of history could be paid with the promise of liberated grandchildren rather than avenged ancestors. And it needs to be both for Benjamin. And so for me, on the one hand, this is an imperative then to think about what liberated grandchildren would look like. And there was a section which I actually cut, and I regret cutting from the conclusion, where I engaged with the famous Bobby Sands quote, the Irish hunger striker, that our revenge will be the laughter of our children. And I engaged this then through some queer theories around the fetishization of the child, Lee Edelman's No Future among them, and also some of the new work that's been coming out around feminist critiques of the family. And thinking about, well, what does it mean then when we fetishize the child, and what would a defetishized notion of the future look like? That would also be about avenging the past as well. And I think ultimately the revenge that I would like to take on capitalism would be one that would vindicate all of those struggles that were waged against it in both its exploitative and its colonial face throughout history. And it's through rekindling that connection to those previous generations in some ways that I think we then are able to transcend those pathologies of revenge, which we've been mentioning in the Q&A, where you simply see Marxists or socialists take over and then reinstate the state form, or even worse, become these kind of regimes of revenge that just perpetuate themselves by annihilating their internal enemies and that sort of thing. It's through that engagement with both the future and the past, the descendants yet to come and the ancestors we never knew, that I think we can develop this thing I'm calling the avenging imaginary. And I would just say that, here, again, to bring it back to my own context in Thunder Bay, Anishinaabe thought here, which I will not claim to be an expert on or to fully understand, but it's very interesting that, like, in political meetings here and discussions around what it would mean to overcome, in our abolitionist conversations here about what it would mean to abolish police and prisons, the thing that you hear often from elders in the community and young activists is that whatever our solutions need to be, they need to be based on thinking about those people who tried to create the world for us 7 generations ago, and those people who we are building the world for 7 generations hence. So 7 generations, we never knew those people, and we will never know those people. And there's something about that way of thinking, to my mind, that opens up a very different horizon than thinking about grandchildren, like literal grandchildren, like people like 2 generations from now, or thinking about literal grandparents 2 generations prior.
Thank you so much, Max, for your presentation and the discussion. I don't think we have any questions left. We're 10 minutes over time, so I think that's a decent mark, isn't it? So I think we're going to leave it with that, and thank you everyone for joining, and hope to see some of you for the next events.